There once lived a fiddler in Frankfurt am Main. His back had a hump, but his fiddling was fine. On the way to his house, he crossed the square. He crossed the square. A crowd of lovely ladies was gathering there. She tapped on his shoulder and counted to 10. The fiddler stood slender and tall once again. Oh, I'll fiddle no more, cried he with glee, cried he with glee. For now the pretty maids will go dancing with me.
You've been listening to a folk song arranged for chorus by Johannes Brahms and sung by the Roger Wagner Chorale under the direction of Roger Wagner. It's from an old, out-of-print monaural recording, and I found it just last Christmas in a record collector's store. I'd lost my copy many years ago. And when it popped up in the record bins, I knew again the meaning of the 14th day of Christmas, a time when you feel connected to your own life and can see it and experience it with new meaning and joy. Brahms wrote another piece of music, the Deutsches Requiem, not based on the Roman Catholic Mass for the dead, full of guilt, doom, and prayers for redemption, but a prayer of comfort for the living. Choosing his own texts and writing in his native German, his masterpiece is at once gentle and eloquent, a celebration of life, part Liebeslieder waltz, and part eternal hope for life beyond the grave. The Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra and the Los Angeles Master Chorale under Carla Maria Giulini performed the Requiem in Los Angeles in 1982. I lived in Seattle at the time, was not able to fly to LA for the concerts, but I had to wait until early the next year to hear a broadcast via public radio, a splendid FM stereocast. I breathlessly arrived home from a singing tour, just in time to punch the red record button and tape. As I listened to the broadcast, I was incredibly moved and reminiscent as the choir uttered the pianissimo opening words that translate from the German, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." When I started writing this, it was a few weeks later. I found myself in Westwood, and I was eating pizza at La Barbara's, sipping a martini. I had just come from seeing a beautifully made but ugly film that celebrated death and violence, and a futuristic motorcycle character of heroic proportions in the technical perfection of 70mm and stereophonic sound. Its only positive effect was to motivate me to write this brief celebration of Brahms, and one of my lifelong heroes, Roger Wagner, and a part of my own life. The Baumgarten boy was blond and a little chunky. "Isn't he husky?" the clothing salesman used to say politely. He was average height for his age, but Barry, now called David, thought of himself as fat. I find it a little easier to talk of myself in the third person for a while. So, Barry thought of himself as fat. He wasn't, but that didn't make him feel better when he looked in the mirror and noticed his breasts were rounded like a pubescent girl's, or when he imagined the other boys in the gym class were laughing at him in the showers. He hated gym, wasn't very good at it. Old pot-bellied Shafcall would blow his whistle and order the class to run 4 times around the track, equaling the mile. 4 awful, wind-sucking, tears-in-the-eyes times, painful and hated, and always finished among the stragglers that followed far behind the proud, heroic championship boys. Shafcall blowing his whistle as the boys rounded the 3rd lap, and Barry was thinking of the note he could persuade his mother to write about his heart condition. The note that later got him away from Shafcall's whistle and gave him a place with the other docile, large-breasted boys as a track manager. Now, track manager meant that he would push a small metal cart on the field, lining it with lime dust, and pitch wet sawdust into the huge high-jumping pits after an occasional rain. The smell of locker rooms and wet sawdust have remained a lifetime. It was the same year that Husky Barry climbed the steep hill of the Hollywood Bowl on a long June's evening. The Los Angeles Times had a note in the entertainment column. Auditions to sing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in the Hollywood Bowl. Tuesday night, Roger Wagner, choral director. Call for an appointment. Twice a week, I'd been taking singing lessons from an Italian ex-vaudevillian named Will Maginetti. He and his wife, Dorothy, gave me much courage to face my life. But in those days, I didn't know enough to be scared. I vocalized and sang my favorite musical comedy, Sentimental Ballads, and even attempted an aria or two in my high but not quite tenor vibrato. The one thing I didn't learn from them was how to read music. I still can't, though I earn a living singing. But that's another story. My high school friend, Nancy Ferris, and I drove into the deserted bowl parking lot in my mother's powder blue Ford and climbed the hill to the great shell. From behind, the shell looked like a fading aqua green movie set with its famous giant curved arches jutting out angularly. In the front, it faced a huge pear-shaped hillside of benches and boxes that seemed to reach to the sky. There were no lights now, and dusk was closing in as we found the backstage door. We heard the sound of a large female voice singing scales. I noticed sweat on my palms. I breathed deeply and opened the door. The soprano finished her scales, and a man at the piano made a few notes and then nodded to her that the audition was through. He was strongly built, and his voice was loud and had a large bass resonance. A young woman with a nervous smile greeted us. She introduced herself as Sally Terry and checked us in on her sign-up sheet. We filled out the cards, and Nancy was ushered to the piano and introduced to the man with the loud voice. As he turned, I got a good look at him for the first time. He had a mustache, not a slight mustache, but an imposing one that seemed to reach out beyond the sculpture of his face. His mouth curled long and sensually under the brown bristles. Nancy began unsteadily as the man started through the scales, checking the outer limits of her voice. Nancy hooted more than she sang, but the hoots were on pitch, and he seemed satisfied. He handed her some oratorio score and asked her to sing the alto part. Nancy, a piano student all her life and a church choir singer at 12, sang from the open book easily. Sweat began to pour from my thick blonde hair. I couldn't read music, not a note. God! Voices echoed somewhere in my ears. And I thought back to the tears running down my 5-year-old cheeks as I sat at the piano, my mother unwilling to make me practice. And to the recital when I played Gurgling Brook from a little red grade 1 piano book. I'd taken a bow with a great flourish, and it was the applause I now remembered, not how to play. Hard times had curtailed my lessons, or perhaps my mother's unwillingness to see me get through anything I was crying about. Barry Baumgarten, Sally Terry's voice interrupted, and I was led to the piano. The man was already playing the scales. Sally nodded. "This is Roger Wagner." He scarcely glanced at me. My changing tenor quivered as I strained for G's and A-flats, but even I could hear a pleasant and melodic ring in my young voice. "Your second tenor," said Wagner. And then the dreaded moment came. My hands were jello. The open score shoved in front of me read Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, choral finale. He flipped deep into the pages. "Here, read this." The pause was telegraphic if my face wasn't. He looked at me carefully for the first time and encouraged me. Nancy and I were much younger than anybody had been before us. The imposing man, I thought him lion-like. Didn't let on about that, but expected us to behave professionally. The page was filled with a foreign language, music. He played the pitch several times, and a warmth seemed to descend on me. I'm not willing to call that warmth God, but it since has descended upon me several times, and I knew that I was in a special place. I knew that I was home. I knew that I was powerful, even if, as I believed, undeserving. I began to sing, and my voice seemed to gravitate towards the tenor line. I sang, "Joyful, thou source of light immortal, daughter of Elysium." The words were in English, not Schiller's and Beethoven's native German. The performance was to be conducted in English, because Los Angeles was thought not sophisticated enough in those days for foreign language choral works, something that has changed drastically over the past 30 years. The imposing man took the shaking score from my hand. He thanked me and said they'd notify me by mail. His manner was formal and his voice noncommittal. The stage door squeaked closed, and we descended into the parking lot. The June night was long and orange-blossomed, promising a warm July to the palms lining the Cahuenga Pass. The little Ford turned by itself easily towards the valley. I felt exhilarated and scared. The Ford stopped at the Van Nuys Bob's Big Boy, and Nancy and I talked animatedly between gulps. We agreed that it had been a good experience, and we were happy to return to wet sawdust pits, glee clubs, and Presbyterian choirs. However, we were never to return in the same way again. A week later came the postcard. You've been accepted. The first rehearsal would be at the Assistants League Playhouse for William Walton's Belshazzar's Feast, to be performed in the Hollywood Bowl conducted by the composer, and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony to be conducted by Otto Klemper. But I can't read music, my inner ears protested over and over. This can't be true. Roger Wagner knew I couldn't sight sing. It's got to be a mistake. Sally Terry made a mistake, a secretarial error. I was only 16. Everybody was older. I called Nancy. She had been accepted, too. Well, she can read music, I thought. I was bewildered and frustrated. And then, at last, proud and accepting. I called my singing teacher and his wife. He distrusted choral directors. They ruined solo voices, he'd say. But now he seemed proud. That's fine, Barry, that's fine. Mom and Dad seemed pleased that I was going to sing in the Hollywood Bowl, and that's what they told their friends over and over. It seemed to me as if they really didn't understand anything else about it. The Roger Wagner Chorale is what echoed over and over in my own ears. The first rehearsal came, and I discovered some really interesting things, even though Roger Wagner wasn't there. First of all, the Roger Wagner chorale expanded and contracted like frozen and heated water. The original chorus had 14 voices and sang small-scaled choral works from liturgical polyphony to the 20th century composers. It also provided the zoom, zoom, zoom background for the early TV sitcom series I Married Joan, something that is rarely listed in the chorale's credits. Now the chorale was to tackle the large-scale choral works, and so was augmenting to over 100 voices, 150 at its largest. The core group were professional union singers, and the augmentation came from the best singers in the community, often choir directors or music teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and movie extras. I discovered upon looking around at the first rehearsal that Nancy and I at 16 were the youngest members by at least 2 or 3 years, something that gave us secret pleasure. The Roger Wagner Chorale and its director were in England performing for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. The fledgling chorus in its first couple of years was invited to perform abroad, had raised money to send itself, and was bringing fame and glory to old Los Angeles and its young and imposing founder-director. We started working with an assistant. The wild and intricate harmonies of William Walton's Belshazzar's Feast were difficult, but they were exciting too. I felt deeply at sea. I found a trick of listening to my neighbor's second tenor, who could sight sing very well, and I'd sing an instant later. I got very proficient at this form of fudging, but when Roger would tirade, as he often did, against lazy musicians who couldn't sight sing, sweat would break out, and a sinking feeling would engulf me. Roger Wagner returned in triumph from England. It was soon understood that everyone called him Roger, except for a brief period many years later when he insisted on being referred to as Dr. Wagner. We worked very hard on Monday nights. Belshazzar's Feast at that time was an unknown work with only one set of 78s, and Walton himself was coming from England to conduct. The work sizzled with drama and brooding choral writing. The 120-voice chorale began to mold into a mighty and homogeneous sound, a sound that I was to come to recognize as the Wagner sound over the next 32 years. Everyone seemed to have a fine voice, but you didn't hear the individual voices. I've often wondered what it was like to be the choir master, the one who trained and understood the piece, only to turn a baton over to someone else to realize the public performance, the conductor. Over the years, I've watched Roger Wagner turn over his work, often not fully appreciated, to other conductors who had less passion, less understanding, and sometimes less musicianship. However, there must be great satisfactions, too. When the likes of Walton or Otto Klemper, Leopold Stokowski, Bruno Walter, William Steinberg, Igor Stravinsky, George Schulte, Erich Leinsdorf, Eugene Ormandy, and Aaron Copland, Sir Adrian Bolt, and Alfred Wallenstein conducted your preparations, and the newer directors, Zubin Mehta, Neville Mariner, Seiji Ozawa, Carla Maria Giulini, and Michael Tilson Thomas, they conducted your preparations. At 16, Roger Wagner was to me a hero. The feelings still remain, conjured up as I recently read a review of his 70th birthday concert at the Los Angeles Music Center. Nobody would describe Roger Wagner as a modest man. He's a lion full of himself and sometimes a bull. To be at a Wagner rehearsal is to experience hilarious tirades at the chorale for sounding like a church choir, or like some amateur group making a name for itself without paying professional wages to union members. He mortgaged his own house to pay professionals and expected them to behave like professionals. He also has great respect for voices and has never asked them to force for an effect or push beyond their endurance. Out of his chorale has come such beautiful and world-famous voices as Marilyn Horne and Marnie Nixon, Harve Presnell, Sally Terry and Karen Armstrong, Carol Neblett and Claudine Carlson, and there are countless others who have gone on to become soloists and musicians of stature and power in their own hometown symphonies and choirs, schools and colleges. There are perhaps 1,000 choral directors who have started because of workshops or performances with Roger Wagner, or listening to the more than 50 recordings on Capitol and Angel Records. Unlike the lion in The Wizard of Oz, who was courageous and didn't know it himself, I have seen Roger truly courageous, and I would have preferred to hear about it from somebody else. Which brings me to another topic. I've never learned to read music properly, as though I was stuck when those 5-year-old piano lessons were jerked away. I vowed never to do that to my children, and yet I can see how hard it is as a traveling parent to provide the place, the instruments, and the discipline to keep children at their music. At 18, I was terrified that Roger Wagner might find me out. I remember one orchestral rehearsal for the Brahms Requiem in the old Los Angeles Shrine Auditorium, when Alfred Wallenstein turned to Roger. The choir was singing flat and raggedy. Roger, the lion, was chewing gum nervously, and I could hear the church choir tirades and singers who didn't do their homework. It was funny in rehearsal, not funny now. Wallenstein whispered something to Roger, and Roger's face turned red. The rehearsal went on. It was critical. Orchestra rehearsals are few, and they cost a lot of money. Roger started stationing himself throughout the choir, listening to the individual singers. First the sopranos, the pitch seemed a little better. Roger had a special affinity for sopranos. He'd always been a threat to tenors. And if there's some Roger Wagner tenors reading or listening to this story, I hope they'll throw their heads back and laugh, and remember the tirades and the innuendos with affection and humor. He went on to the altos and basses, who were safe for some reason. But then he came back to the tenors, and he stood beside me, tiger-like and threatening. My little trick of singing a second behind the singer next to me failed. My still adolescent tenor, with its ring, failed. My courage and stomach trembled at the tiger's thoughts, and I fainted. No, I stopped singing and sat down as though I were sick and not feeling well. I wanted my mother to write a note so I could pitch wet sawdust and not run around the track. Roger didn't say anything to me, but he went with great purpose to a thin, handsome young fellow who acted as attendant secretary for the chorale. He was an actor named John, whose last name I can't remember, though Roger probably could. Roger pointed up at me and whispered in John's ear. I was certain Roger said, "Off with his head." My lip reading was very good, you know, and I knew I was deservedly out on my ear. The next day, I came to the final orchestra rehearsal, and everything went better. The choir came together and sang with the old Wagner sound, on pitch and accurately, in that barn of a theater called the Shrine Auditorium, where I once heard great opera singers ring the rafters, literally miles away from the stage. John took attendance. I thought he gave me a peculiar look as my name was read. We were supposed to pick up 2 free tickets at that time. That's how they paid the large extra Roger Wagner chorale in those days. There was no ticket envelope for me. God, my heart leapt. That's it. I've been kicked out. John looked at me. See me after rehearsal. A lump arose, but I sang as well as I could, right on the beat, not an instant behind my neighbor. I sang with courage, and I felt as though my heart would break. At the end of rehearsal, Roger had stopped chewing and was relaxed and started joking with John. I waited until Roger had gone over to joke with some sopranos, and I approached John. He handed me a ticket envelope. "Here, I found it. See you tomorrow." But there must be some mistake. I'm supposed to be kicked out. But I just figured out John was too kind to do it. What had Roger said when he pointed at me yesterday? Who knows? Probably better check Barry. He's not feeling well. Surely Sally Terry had made a mistake when she sent me the card letting me know I was in the chorale, and now John was just too kind to kick me out. Whatever the truth, I sang happily in the Roger Wagner chorale for many years, and I learned to love a whole literature of choral music while singing in a world-class chorus. I realize now that I could have not written or finished this story more than a year ago when I vowed to myself to complete it. For after all, heroes are heroes, and hero worship is hero worship, and Roger has been an Olympian hero to me. Incidentally, Roger was a true Olympian almost. He qualified for the Olympian decathlon for his native France in 1936, the year I was born, but his village couldn't raise enough money to send the team. All his life, he has swam or played tennis. He has survived cancer operations and criticism. He has survived threatened tenors making a name for themselves on other people's names. I've always listed my 8 years with the Roger Wagner Chorale as a credit on my booking brochures, even though I didn't ever sing with a smaller professional group. I listed it sometimes out of publicity and sometimes out of proud acknowledgement. The truth is, I couldn't read music properly, a very important requirement for being in the Roger Wagner Chorale. I've never heard Roger brag about the Olympics, but there is part of his tigerness that I have seen as boastful and competitive and jealous, particularly when he wasn't recognized for his gifts or criticized. I've heard him verbally putting down some other conductor, and I've seen him threatened and paranoid. like me at the orchestra rehearsal. I've also seen a very large part of him that is incredibly energetic, self-demanding and self-denying, creative and inventive, with good humor and a great deal of care and concern for others. But I'm getting ahead of myself. They got rid of old Wallenstein in Los Angeles to make the Philharmonic a truly world-class orchestra, first with Zubin Mehta, and then in its prime with Carla Maria Giulini. A funny thing happened in Los Angeles. They sing choral music in its original language now. To me, and to many, Roger Wagner is primarily a Los Angeles story. However, I know that the performance of choral music in the United States, and the whole world for that matter, is much finer and has higher standards because of Roger Wagner and his colleague Robert Shaw. And perhaps I should mention too pop artist Fred Waring. Back in the days, when the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra performed in barns and old Baptist churches, when I was school-bussed with a sugar-covered French donut digesting in my belly on a Saturday morning to the Symphonies for Youth, conducted by an erstwhile hack playing music that my dad would play for me in old 78s. Back in the days, when I bought complete sets of Beethoven's Ninth for teenage friends and still circled my toy train round the Christmas tree. Back when a young, ambitious choral conductor took an excited group of 24 singers to London to sing for the Queen, and later to sing for the Pope. And they began to make a name for themselves as the Roger Wagner Chorale. Back in the days when the incredible Mrs. Norman Chandler, with the power and prestige of the Los Angeles Times behind her, somewhere under the rainbow, saved the Hollywood Bowl so I could sing Belshazzar's Feast before she went on to build the Los Angeles Music Center, including the great symphony hall that bears her name and houses world-class music and each year's Movie Academy Awards. Yes, back in those days, Roger Wagner was engaged to conduct a major performance of Verdi's Te Deum and Requiem at the Hollywood Bowl. This time the soloists were not from his own chorale, but included Leontine Price and Richard Tucker, Georgia Tozzi. Roger always had a flair for theater, and Verdi's music is theatrical. The other soloist for the evening was a huge Indian drum, which Roger imported from Arizona to thunder in the Dies Irae, two percussionists leaping in the air, frightening the season subscribers in the boxes and the dollar spectators in the heavens. My hero was a lion that night, and the chorale sang like lions. And Leontine Price was singing her first of a long line of Verdi requiems. Roger was the total conductor there, and the Los Angeles Philharmonic, poised on the point of its greatness to come, played wonderfully under him, brass choirs in the newly built spotlight towers playing in perfect synchronization with the conductor who was miles away on the stage. He took the large chorale and its smaller touring group, and with the organizational help of the Los Angeles Junior Chamber of Commerce, created the Los Angeles Master Chorale, which was invited to be one of the original 5 resident artistic companies. For over 20 years, the Master Chorale has performed most of the great choral works and many first performances in a season of 5 or 6 concerts of its own each year in the Music Center. And all the while, the Master Chorale has been the resident chorus for the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra in both the Music Center and the Hollywood Bowl. He has dutifully and wonderfully prepared a world-class chorus for the Philharmonic, including the incredibly beautiful performance of Brahms' Requiem I began telling this story with. A story that has stretched over my life, including 8 years as a singer in the Roger Wagner Chorale and years as a follower. There is another part of the story, a little like Toto pulling back the curtain of the mighty Oz, the choral wizard of Oz, at once lion, tiger, and bear. Every Christmas, for many years, I journeyed in the pre-dawn hours to a large decaying church in the south-central part of Los Angeles, where I heard Palestrina's polyphony sung with the grace and intonation that would be the envy of a holy day pilgrim come to the Sistine Chapel. Roger Wagner's sitting in the loft at the organ, and 8 or 10 singers gathered around singing the carols, the great medieval music, and the liturgy with its Gregorian modes. Though not a Roman Catholic, I heard that music for the first time in its most natural setting, fascinated as I watched the people of several cultures getting down on their knees, united in prayer and music. It was conducted by one of the world's leading musicians. In those days, not so long ago, you could go to St. Joseph's Church almost any Sunday, and you could hear Roger improvise at the great organ and lead singers in the smoke and candle acoustics with buttressed arches echoing far from the din of politics and music critics. Some of the singers had sung with Roger since they were boys in the St. Joseph's Boy Choir. If Roger Wagner had on occasion seemed like a lion or a tiger, there was another side, not a bear, but a kind of teddy bear, whose generosity, loyalty, and spiritual devotion propelled many others through hardships and failures to reach their own dreams. Almost every Roger Wagner chorale concert for all these years has begun with a Gregorian setting of the Ave Maria, followed by the Victoria's 16th century setting, an invocation and a thanksgiving, surely Roger's, for the many gifts that life has brought him, or maybe just a good luck charm. Who knows?
Dear, dear, what can the matter be? Oh dear, what can the matter be? Johnny so long at the fair. Oh dear, what can the matter be? Dear, dear, what can the matter be? Oh dear, what can the matter be? Johnny so long at the fair. He promised to buy me a beautiful fairy and gave me the places the girls are all wearing. He promised he'd bring me a bunch of blue ribbons to tie up my bonny brown hair. Bonny brown hair. He promised he'd buy me a bunch of red roses. Like Alvin and lilies and basket of posies. He promised he'd bring me a little straw hat to set off the blue ribbons that tie up my bonny brown hair. Oh dear, what can the matter be? Dear, dear, what can the matter be? Oh dear, what can the matter be? Johnny so long at the fair. Oh dear, what can the matter be? Dear, dear, what can the matter be? Oh dear, what can the matter be? Johnny so long at the fair. Oh dear, Johnny so long at the fair. Oh dear, Johnny so long at the fair.